What's going on, guys? So today I will be showing how I am making my ignition coil sub-harness for the R35 ignition coils that will be going onto the 2JZ Aristo head that will be going into the IS300. And before anyone asks in the comments down below, no, you can't run individual ignition coils on the factory IS300 ECU. I'm running engine management, so that's how I'm able to do that. It gives you more functionality with doing custom things like this. First, I'm going to talk about how I made the harness and show that, and then I'm going to show how it fits on the head without the head really bolted into the engine, because I don't have the head in the engine as it is. I'll just show how each one of the plugs line up on top of each one of the cylinders. So this is the ignition coil sub-harness section, and it was basically made from a 2010 Toyota Tacoma V6 engine harness. I used a section of the harness that went to the injectors, and I also used a section of the harness for power and ground wires. I used a section of the harness that goes to the individual ignition coils that were on the 2010 Tacoma. So I used those because they were the appropriate gauge that I needed, and I used the injector wires because they were appropriate gauge that I needed, and they were all different colors, so they were pretty thick. Now, just going through everything that this harness is made of, and then I'm going to show how I'm going to pin that last wire there, which is this blue one. So I'm going to show how that's all held together. But this is pretty much the end result of it. I just have to connect that one blue wire into the plug. All of these connectors, so these are new connectors. On eBay, you can order a connector refresh kit for your car, and in my case, this is for the IS300. But when I bought the pack on eBay, it gave me the option to swap out the factory ignition coils, which is the 3 wasted spark setup ignition coils, for the individual ignition coils, and it had a few options to choose from. In my case, I chose the R35 coil plugs because that's what I'm using on this. And I've already taped together some of these, but the basics, like going through how Toyota made the harness, I didn't have to do much. This was a fairly straightforward wiring job. So on the 2010 Tacoma, this is the ground section that was for the individual ignition coils, as well as a few other things. So I have a few extra grounds that I can run to one of the body ground points if I want to. So I would have this connected to the engine ground, and this is just far away enough from cylinder 6 on my Supra intake manifold that I have. This reaches one of the 10mm spots that I can bolt the ground point into. So this is perfect. And then this ground wire is 16 gauge ground wire, and all the ground wires are bundled together here to where they split off. Like 2 of them go forward, and then 4 of them go backwards, and then they connect all together. But there's 7 wires bundled together here by Toyota from the factory. I didn't have to bundle them together. I love this. That's why I really like using the factory harnesses whenever I do stuff like this, because there's 7 wires bundled here together perfectly. It lasts hundreds and hundreds of thousands of miles this way, the way the Toyota did it. All I did was just trim off a bit of the end of the wire and then cut it the length that I really needed it, so that it goes into these connectors and that each one is lined up in with the distance that it's supposed to be away from each other. But this is perfect. This is not this ground point, and it's the same thing for this this power bundle where they're all bundled together. But it's just the best way that you can put something together like this and then have it neat. I didn't spend hours trying to bundle 7 wires together and solder them together. This is all done already. The advantage of using a factory harness. So the ground and the power wires are both bundled together like that. So the 7 wires bundled together here for the power, and then this one is long enough, so this is the main power wire. It's still black with the red stripe, just like the other wires on the IS300 that are the power wires. Most of them are black with the red stripe, so this matches the wire colors also, just like white with a black stripe is Toyota ground. And then brown is also, so it's brown going into that. But this is long enough to reach to my factory fuse and relay box, so I could put an extra relay in there that's only for the R35 ignition coil. And the gauge for this wire for the power is 14 gauge wire, and that's how it is on the Tacoma ignition coils. It's 14 gauge for the power, 16 gauge for the ground. And then their injectors were 18 gauge wire, and that's actually what this called for. So The specs on this harness, when I looked it up, it should be 18 gauge for the signal wire that comes from the ECU to fire each one of these ignition coils. And it should be 16 gauge for the power and the ground wire that go into each one of these connectors. The ground wire is 16 gauge, and then this power wire is a little bit more heavy duty with 14 gauge. So that's kind of the advantage of that, is that it's slightly thicker, but it doesn't really matter that much. It's all connected really well. There's no other solder points in this harness. It's really just bundled together here and bundled together here at the ground. The individual wire colors, I was kind of limited by the wires that I had to use on the Tacoma harness because of gauge. And the only wires that I could use that were the right gauge, there's a red one, yellow one, green one, and blue one. And I lined them up based off of the color spectrum: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Didn't have orange, so just went from red, skipped orange, yellow, green, blue. There was a purple, but it wasn't thick enough, so I couldn't use that in its place. So I instead used the white and the black. So the black wire, the red wire, yellow, green, and blue, they all came from the injector section of the Tacoma harness. With this white wire, it came from one of the O2 sensors in that section of the harness. And I used the white one and the black one because those two are the longest. Instead of putting, like, I don't know, white one at the beginning and a black one at the back or whatever, I use those two, so white, black. And then I have the 4 colored wires on the back side because those were the shorter ones. But I still have to get 18 gauge wire for each one of these wire colors, with the exception of the power and the ground wire. But I have to get 5 feet on each one of these because the longest one still needs to be 5 feet long. That way it can reach to where I have my engine management. So yeah, nice compact harness. So I am going to set up the tripod and then show how these pins are put into these plugs. It's pretty easy. I've been putting a dot of solder on each one after I crimp it, just so that it's a little bit, it's connected a little bit better, and then I'll clip this in after it's all together. But this was the original plug on the Toyota section of the harness. It's just a little 4-pin, it's the 4-pin coils that Toyota uses. I have the tripod set up right there. I'm really just going to put my mask on because with soldering, you definitely need to have a mask on. So I'm going to do that, put this together, solder it, and then show how it all fits on top of the head. Excuse the workbench, it's a little bit of a mess, but the coil assembly, everything on the bracket is all under here, so it fits. This is nice. This is just up because, I don't know, but it fits down snug. This, even when nothing's under it, that tends to sit up like that. I'm not sure why. So first of all, before I really get into this, this isn't fully finished. This is mocked up and then set into place. I actually have to remake this bracket, which is why I'm doing this video, because I want to post it tonight. The way that I was making it was working perfectly, but what I did was, when I was drilling out, the spacing between these holes is just over 92 millimeters. The cylinder spacing between the center of this cylinder, the center of this cylinder, the center of this one. So it's just over 92 millimeters for drilling each one of these holes. And I was drilling the holes out to be about 1.25 inches so that the boot goes in, so that this boot that's around the coil goes in. But this one I made 20 millimeters off. So it's supposed to sit like right here, but it's here. There's no way that I could put that coil in at an angle. It's just not going to work. These wires are a bit of a tight fit now that I've put this all together. So what I should have done in hindsight was, after I made the bracket, I should have routed these wires around in a cleaner fashion so that they went to the spot they were supposed to go. I naively thought that I could have all the coils lined up straight in a row, but I completely forgot about these two little hoses, hose number 1, hose number 2, that go between the valve covers. Those are in the way of the coils being able to sit perfectly, so I have to angle each one of them in a weird way. These can't ever be straight because they'll be bumping another coil, but it's not bad. It still fits. So talking about wiring, I have, like, this is the 10-foot section of wire that I soldered on. So the Tacoma harness made it to here, and that only gives me about 3 to 4 feet after it leaves the engine. So I needed at least 5 feet, and I ordered 10 feet of each one of these wire colors. And this is 18 gauge, and that's soldered straight to this wire. And then I double heat shrinked it just for added security, I guess. As far as getting these coils to fit on top of the spark plugs, so the spark plugs that the R35 uses, they're actually they have a thin top that goes into this boot. Like this is for a Toyota Sienna. I just kind of used this for a visual example. The hole that's in this is a little bit larger than the hole that's in the bottom of these R35 coils that goes around the spark plug. Also, the threads for the R35 spark plugs are 12 millimeter threads, where the threads that go into the 2JZ are 14 millimeters. So accounting for that, what I actually had to do was I just drilled out the bottom of the coil, and I'll show, it's actually just the rubber boot. It's not even the coil part itself. So this boot pops off really easily, just with a screwdriver under there. You can probably pull on it hard enough and pull this up, but there's no spring inside of this. This is just straight silicone because it's not meant to conduct, it's meant to shield. But all I did is, if you look at the top of that, oh, that was perfect. Man, that's like the ideal placement for, yay me. So if you line up these two boots side by side, you can see that this one is large and this one is small. I mic'd these. This one is 0.315 thousandths of an inch, and this one is 0.384 thousandths of an inch. So I'm also mic'd my drill bits, and I found the most close drill bit that would get to that size. I think this is a 3/8. This is, all of the marking on this is rubbed off because I've used it so much, but I basically drilled into this as it sat on the coil so that it took out that inside piece of rubber, because this thing is not a solid piece of silicone all the way down. It's just the top here that has this part that seats onto the spark plug. So what I saw online when I was looking up some install videos of this coil on different applications, they were recommending putting dielectric paste on the top of this coil so that it slides over the spark plug easily, but I didn't want to do that because that's still putting this boot under stress, and I do not want this boot to crack, because if this boot cracks, then that risks the spark escaping from the boot, because this is supposed to be an insulator. So that risks the spark escaping from the boot and then tapping on the head, and that makes a loud tapping noise. You think you have a problem with your engine, and you have to figure out what's going on. I've investigated those before. So that just comes from a cracked boot. I don't want that to happen, so I am drilling this out. And this drills out really easily. I put tape on it because that's the depth that it goes down to before it starts drilling into this plastic. So that's as far as you need to drill down, but I basically, you don't even have to go down that far, because when you pop this rubber silicone boot off, this is the only section that needs to be opened up. Everything in here is really hollow and really wide. The other things that I tried before drilling that out, so I have a couple of these coils, right? You see I have two coils here in one boot. So what I did is, this one actually has a spring inside of it that I dropped somewhere. And that spring gives you the connectivity for the spark. And this, as it is, snaps onto the bottom of the R35 coil. So if I had a longer spark plug well, I could easily just pop this on to the top of this coil, and then I need to make sure that that spring did make contact with the other spring, because this has its own little spring inside of it, and then this has a spring. So that would be a spring touching a spring instead of a spring touching a spark plug. So I would have to figure something else out if I were to use this. But if I were to just use it as a shield thing, so I did a few things. I cut the top off of this, and then I cut the bottom off of this, trying to experiment with with fitting the boot. That's the middle piece. I don't need that. So this is the bottom, and when I cut the bottom off, obviously this fits well around the spark plug, but that hole doesn't have anything to latch onto because there's a lip that's around this hard plastic piece here. So there's a lip that this would latch onto. So this didn't work. I'm like, okay, well, I'll try using the other thing. So this actually snaps around that lip that's there. But the problem with this is the hole on this side still needs to be enlarged. And I could enlarge this. I could enlarge this and use it and snap it around the plastic piece here. But I would possibly still have the problem with whenever I do remove these coils, this being stuck to the spark plug and then me having to fish that out, where this one is going to stay on. So I just opted for drilling this out instead. But I didn't have to enlarge it much for it to slip over, and it didn't even enlarge it to the full width of this drill bit. It just enlarged it just enough to where it shaved out some of the rubber, and then it made it easier for it to slip over the spark plug. So now they slip over the spark plug really easily, and they're all sitting in place. They're snug. They come off easily. It pops when it slides off, so you know it's making an airtight seal to the top of the spark plug. So that keeps the spark transfer pretty clean between the spring and the top of the spark plug. There will be minimal corrosion because there's minimal air getting in, because I can hear that pop whenever I slide this off of the spark plug. So that's all good. So talking about how I made this bracket, this is basically 1/8 inch aluminum angle bar, which was this. I cut it this way so that I could use the lip, and I used angle bar so that I could use the lip on the side, because if you look here, there's not much aluminum left on either side of this hole after the hole's drilled out. So when I was thinking ahead about how I wanted to make this, I wanted to make sure I had a lip going down the side of this bracket that holds all the coils, so that way it gives it a little more rigidity. It's harder for it to bend around those holes, because this is the last thing that I would want to do is bend this thing around where the coil mounts. A little over 92mm spacing between all of them. So the exact spacing that I used between each one of these cylinders was 92mm between here and here, and it was like 185mm from here to here, and then from here to here it was 277, and then I think 370 to here, and then 460 something to here. It wasn't exactly 460, it was like 464 or 465, something like that. But if you measure it out and you put, I like millimeters because it seems to be more exact with measuring things like this, but I'm in America, so we use inches. But millimeters, it helps out with something like this, because it's easier to visualize how you're stepping it up between each cylinder, if that makes sense. So that's the spacing. As far as the spacers, what I did was I used these. So this is basically this, more aluminum, and this is just aluminum tube. And I don't know the diameter of this, the sticker is gone, but it's roughly a 1/2 inch outside diameter. So as long as it's enough of a diameter to fit around a 10mm bolt, that's all you need. So this would be, I mean, this isn't really a 10mm bolt, but it's that, I think, what is it, M6 thread, I think, that the 10mm head uses, but that's what would go into the threads that go into the head that are holding my bracket down. But this is, I think it's like 5mm possibly. I'm not sure. I don't know what this is from, but these are what's holding my bracket down, and so I have a few of these made. Didn't need a ton of them. I think I have 3 of them, but I didn't need a ton of them to give it to make it sturdy. And the bolts that have to go through this, that are long enough to go through this spacer and the 1/8 flat bar, they're between, you can use anything from 1.5 inch to 1 3/4 inch. But the thickness of this is 1.139 thousandths of an inch, and it doesn't have to be that. It can be like plus or minus a couple thousandths of an inch. But that's, mine ended up being 1.139 when I measured the distance, the gap between the bottom of this 1/8, I guess it's kind of like flat bar with a lip now, the bottom of this to the top of the head. So these end up working out pretty good. 1.139 thousandths of an inch on 1/8 aluminum flat bar. And there are 6 mount points that I can mount this flat bar to the head, of which I was only planning to use 3 or 4, because I really only need 2 to give it rigidity and make it sturdy, but you know, 3, 4, that would make it even more sturdy. And then now getting to fastening each of the individual coils down. So with fastening the coils down, I have a bunch of these bolts. I think they came out of the cam caps of one of the engines that I salvaged all the bolts from. But these are 1.5 inches long. Just regular 10mm bolts. What I planned on doing was tapping a hole in the flat bar underneath each one of these coils, underneath like where the coil mounts. Not so that I could fasten the bolt down from the top down, because that increases my risk of stripping out the flat bar, but I would actually thread this up through the bottom until it bottoms out on the bottom of the flat bar, and then I can just put 10mm nuts on the top of this. There's enough clearance on the bottom of this flat bar underneath, like around the valve cover and that open area that's in the spark plug well, I guess, or the spark plug valley, I don't know what you want to call it. The problematic coil is this one. So this one, if I turn it the distance that I need to turn it to clear this nipple, it's not sitting on top of the flat bar anymore. So whenever I remake this out of aluminum flat bar, I'm going to have to account for that. So I'm probably going to put the lip, instead of it being on this side, I'm probably going to put the lip on this side and get something that's a little bit wider than 1 1/4 if I could find it. All the other holes line up on top of the flat bar so that I can put that there. On all points, this has pretty much come together with the exception of me being ridiculous and not measuring twice and cutting once. I just measured once and cut, well, 6 times technically, but this hole is off, and now I have to buy another piece of aluminum flat bar and then restart drilling this, which, if I'm going to do that, I'm going to use something a little bit better than a wood hole saw a bit, because this does work. This only took 30 seconds to drill through this 1/8 inch aluminum, but I need something a little bit better that's going to make a little bit cleaner of a hole, because since, yes, nobody is going to see this, I still want it to look nice and not have sharp edges and not cut up my coil boots and everything. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time making this look better. So this, my first attempt, has pretty much turned into an unintended mock-up, but it works. Like, this almost worked perfectly, with the exception of that hole being drilled 20mm off from all of the other ones. So costs. So how much did all of this cost? So aside from the cost of the coils, I think the coils were like $500 or $600 after shipping and everything. I got them from Z1 Motorsports. These plugs came in my connector refresh kit for the engine, because I was refreshing all the connectors on the IS300 engine as I was extending the wire harness. So these connectors came with that kit. All the connectors were $140, but just these 6 connectors, I think you can get them for like maybe $5, $6, $7 a piece. So there's the cost of that. The cost of the wire, so these were like $20, I think, altogether for the 6 wires that were all 10 feet each of the different colors that I needed to connect to the rest of the coils. The wire that I used from the Tacoma harness was $150 for the entire harness by itself, but I had already used most of the wires on that harness in extending the IS300 wire harness, which I did in the last few videos, which was moving the ECU out of the engine bay into the interior so that it's not exposed to engine heat, and it leaves me more room to mount this thing, because my ECU would have been in the way whenever I go to mount this. So I had to move all that out of the way. Got the harness, and these wires were pretty much left over from the harness, and it worked out perfectly with using the gauges that I need. Again, the gauges, I'll have them pop up on the screen, but the gauges that you need for these wires are 16 for the power and ground, and then 18 gauge for the signal wires that go to the ECU. So $30 for the connectors, $20 for the harness, and then $30 for the aluminum angle bar and this aluminum tube. You're really looking at less than $100 for just building this, and then trying to source a wire harness that would have the wire gauge that you need. That's as I used. That's already bundled together. But if you were to make this yourself, I mean, you could make it yourself, but you would have issues with grounding 6 wires and connecting the 6 wires together so that they're all going to the individual coils. All things considered, this was a fairly simple project. It just took a while with me drilling everything out. So that's it for this. I hope this video was helpful, informative, and I hope this leads you down the path of making your own wire harness and bracket instead of spending $300, $400, $500 for someone else's kit. But keep in mind that if you go with someone else's kit, you're spending $400 or $500 on a bracket and a harness that's made to pretty much just bolt up to your head. It comes with boots that you can just swap out on the bottom, and they slip over your spark plugs perfectly fine. And it comes with a wire harness that's pre-made to suit your needs. So you're really saving a few $100s by making it yourself, but I prefer to do things like this and save a few $100s. So this was the way that I did it. It's going to be covered up by the timing belt cover, so nobody's going to see it. It doesn't matter how ugly it looks. It technically could probably be made out of wood, and it doesn't matter because no one's going to see it unless they take the timing cover off. So that's it though. Thanks a lot for watching this video. Make sure you like, subscribe, comment, and as always, God bless you guys.